As a CISO in an organization, you want to make sure you have that conversation with your executives, that they recognize you are going to be breached. It is going to happen. Welcome to Life of a CISO. I'm Dr. Eric Cole, your host, and we'll be taking you on a journey each week on what it takes to be a CISO and what are solutions that you can implement today if you are currently a Chief Information Security Officer or if you want to be one in the future. This is Life of a CISO. Welcome to this week's edition of Life of a CISO with your host, Dr. Eric Cole, where we spend some time going through the challenges of a CISO and tips and tricks you need to take your career to the next level. So whether you're currently a CISO or you want to be a CISO, thank you for joining us, and we'd love to hear any feedback you have. You can send me comments directly at ecole@secure-anchor.com or find more details about Secure Anchor Consulting at www.secure-anchor.com. This week, I'd like to talk about why it's so important to have a CISO, why you need somebody at the helm that's looking at the strategy and making sure that the right areas are being focused on. Because let's face it, organizations are not going to be able to address all of the cybersecurity risks in their environment. It's going to cost way too much money. So a really good CISO is going to take the highest priority, highest risk items and make sure those are addressed within an organization. Because let's face it, companies spend a lot of money, they have a lot of good people, and they still have unacceptable results. We've seen so many companies that are spending significant amount of resources on cybersecurity, yet they get compromised for 3 years, they don't detect it, and they have hundreds of millions of records compromised. That is not an acceptable result. I'm not faulting individuals or people, I'm faulting strategy. In those organizations, they were doing good things, but they weren't doing the right things that really matter. So let me illustrate that point. I have 3 amazing children, and my middle child was a senior this past year, and she came home from high school in September and said, "Dad, I know this is my senior year, and I really want to knock it out of the park. I really want to do a great job and get really good grades. So the teacher just told us that we're having a surprise quiz tomorrow, and I was wondering if you can help me study for the surprise quiz." Now, being a supportive parent, I said, of course. But I'll be honest with you. Unless they change the definition of surprise, right? How exactly did she know they were having the quiz? And she said, "Dad, the quiz is not a surprise. The subject matter is." She said, "We're going to have a test," but she didn't tell us what it was on. So I asked my daughter, "What has the teacher been emphasizing? What has she been pushing?" And she goes, "She's really been pushing mathematics and calculus and differential equations and all that stuff." I said, "Great. I bet you that's what the quiz is on." So I gave my daughter some sample problems, and she got them all wrong. She didn't remember anything from the previous year. So I sat down with her for 3 hours and showed her how to do the mathematical problems. And after 3 hours, she got it. I mean, it clicked. You saw the light in her eye. She was all excited and pumped. And I remember that next morning, she got up all excited, ready to go and conquer that surprise quiz. And that day, I happened to be working from home. So she comes home late afternoon, and I hear the door shut. So I go to greet her to hear how that quiz went. And she sort of walks up. "Hey, Dad, how you doing?" I'm like, "Great, how you doing?" She's like, "Not too good. I didn't do good on that surprise quiz." I said, "But honey, you knew that mathematic inside and out." She says, "Yes, one little problem. The quiz was on history, not mathematics. I didn't do too well." And then I remember her looking at me going, "Dad, I wasted 3 hours yesterday studying mathematics when I could have been doing something much more valuable, like creating TikToks," right? The mind of a teenager, right? And I had to look at her and say, no, honey, those mathematical skills you're going to need. You're going to need for the rest of high school, you're going to need in college, and depending on your profession, you might need them for your job. So spending 3 hours doing those things was good. It was a good investment of your time. It was a good skill to have. Now, in terms of passing the quiz, it wasn't the right thing to do, but it was still a good thing to do overall. And I bring that up because that's the exact same conversation I have with executives after a breach. I'm usually the one that gets called in to talk to the CEO, or in some cases, calm down the CEO after the breach. And it's funny because I walk in the CEO's office and they look very much like my daughter. Oh, what's up, Eric? How you doing? Sort of beat up and down and defeated. And they're like, Eric, I spent all this money and all these resources on security, and we still had a major breach undetected. Spending all that money was a total and complete waste of time and energy. I'm like, no. Trust me. If you didn't spend that money and those resources on cybersecurity, things would be a lot worse. Things would be a heck of a lot worse, and you'd have a lot more breaches. So what you did was a good thing. It was a good foundational thing to do overall. Now, in terms of stopping the adversary, it wasn't the right thing to do, but it was still a good thing to do overall. And that's the problem. Today, many companies' security either isn't at a strategic level, it's very reactionary, just patch and fix, or it's not aligned with the actual threats that are out there. It's not aligned with what the real exposures are to the organization. Cybersecurity is not about firewalls. It's not about IDSs. If we had to give our definition, cybersecurity is all about understanding, managing, and mitigating the risk of critical data being disclosed, altered, or destroyed. So if you really go in and want to break that down through the lens of a CISO, there's really three things you're focusing on. As a CISO, you need to focus on what is the critical information and critical data. You need to understand what are the risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. And then you need to understand what is the priority or focus out of the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Because the problem today is this is what's important and this is what's actually being done. There's a misalignment with the security strategy that's being developed and the needs of the organization. And that is the explanation of why companies can spend so much and still have a breach that goes undetected for a significant period of time that has a major impact to the organization. So let's go in and let's break down each one of those pieces. So let's start off with critical data. If you're a CISO or you're doing virtual CISO services for an entity, you need to go in and understand what is the critical data and the critical business processes that support that. What are the things that are critical to the organization? Because let's face it, what is the difference between a major breach and a minor breach? It's not the systems that get compromised. And it's funny, when I ask that question in sessions, people sometimes go, Eric, a breach is a breach. There is no difference. I'm like, whoa. Isn't there a difference between a major car accident and a minor car accident? If you're sitting at the light and somebody's checking their phone and they roll into your bumper and boom, just a little bump, that's a minor car accident. You're on your way in 20 minutes. But if you're going 80 miles an hour down the road and your car flips 5 times and you have to get airlifted to the hospital, that's a major car accident. What's the difference? The impact to your life and the impact to your assets. So the difference between a major breach and a minor breach is the impact to your business, which directly correlates to your critical data. If somebody breaks into your organization and they don't get any critical data, they don't cause any harm to critical data, they don't either disclose, alter, or destroy critical data, we call that a minor breach. But if they're able to go in and impact a large amount of data, then that's going to be a major breach. So if you want to control your breaches, you want to focus in on your critical data and critical information, right? One of the things I always jokingly say to CISOs is, may all your breaches be minor, right? Notice, you're going to have breaches. It's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, but when. The question is, how do you minimize and control the damage and detect the attack in a timely manner? Just as a quick side note, As a CISO in an organization, you want to make sure you have that conversation with your executives, that they recognize you are going to be breached. It is going to happen. Because one of the big disconnects we see is where executives say, oh, we're spending money on security. We have a CISO. We're never going to get compromised. We're never going to have a breach. It's never going to happen. And then when it does, they're angry, mad. And that's one of the main reasons why in the playbook of most companies, when a breach occurs, the CISO gets fired. It's because the executives had a false expectation. They had a metric of we're not going to have any attacks, which means if you have an attack, if you have a breach, if you have a compromise, that means the CISO failed. You cannot survive as a CISO with a false metric. It's not going to work. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you're sitting down with them and saying, just so you recognize, my job is not to prevent all breaches. We're going to have a breach. It's to make sure all breaches are minimal. We minimize the impact and we detect it in a timely manner. Now, I know sometimes you might think going to an executive or senior leadership and telling them you're going to have a breach seems like it's a negative, but it's not really if you put it in perspective. If you look at your life, nobody is the perfect specimen of a human. There is nobody on the planet that says, I am 100% perfect, I am 100% healthy, and I will never, ever get sick. Well, sorry. There might be some people that say that, right, with big egos, but it's not true, right? Just not a true statement. Every one of us knows that no matter what you do, no matter what you eat, no matter what you take, you're going to get sick at some point. That's just a reality of being a human. So none of us approach life saying we're never going to get sick. None of us approach life saying if we get sick, that's a sign of weakness. But the question is this: why do we exercise, eat healthy, take vitamins? It's not to say we never get sick. It's to minimize the frequency in which we get sick and the impact it has on our lives. That's the same approach we need to take with security. Focusing on 100% security, saying you'll never get breached, is naive at best and is going to always lead to problems. Your approach on security is just like your health. Minimize the frequency in which it happens and minimize the impact that it has on your life. That's the message you want to get across to your executives. It's going to happen, but we're going to control and minimize the damage by controlling and managing our critical data. So the questions you want to start asking is, what is your critical data? Where is it located and who has access to it? Now, here's the problem. Many organizations today, they don't know where their data is. Well, let me be fair. They don't know where all their data is. With most of our clients, if I go in and I say, what is your most critical data or critical information? They're going to go in and say these 5 pieces. And then if I go in and say, where is that data located? They're going to say, oh, it's on these 3 servers. Now, it is on those 3 servers, but it's also on 4 other servers they don't know about. So if your data is really in 7 spots, it's on 3 servers you know about and 4 that you don't, and all your energy is on these 3 servers, where do you think the attacker is going to break in? On the 4 you don't know about. And if you look at all the major breaches, or at least most of the major breaches that have occurred, it's always in cases where data was on servers that the organization wasn't aware about. I don't know any organization after a major breach stood up and said, yes, we deliberately put 100 million records on an internet-facing server that wasn't up to date, that had known vulnerabilities, that wasn't encrypted. Yeah, we purposely did that. Aren't you proud of us? I don't know anyone who's done that. I know a lot of people, right? I don't know any companies that have said that. It's always, oh, we didn't realize the data was there. It's always the data is in a location they are not aware of. So one of the key focus areas for a CISO is to reduce that focus area. If we can control and manage our data, if we can limit the number of locations where that data is and make sure it's backed up correctly and can be recovered, that's really one of the big keys to success, is be obsessed with the data. Now, here's a twist to that most people, when I first say, they go, huh? But then it makes a lot of sense. You also need to know the value of the data and the business processes to the organization. So you need to go in as a CISO and look at the finances of the different product lines. You need to know where your company is making money and where it's not making money. And at first that might seem weird, but let me explain. If you don't know the finances, if you don't know how much revenue and profit your company is making, and you don't know where the biggest profits are coming from, how are you going to decide how much to spend on cybersecurity? I always ask people, what's an appropriate budget? Is $1 million an appropriate security budget? Well, it depends. It depends on what? The finances. If a company is only making $800K profit a year and you want to spend $1 million on security, you'll be laughed out of the room. You're basically going more than the company even makes. That's insane. With a company that makes $800K profit, you might be spending 15 or 20K on security a year. Now, on the other hand, when I worked at Lockheed Martin and I was responsible for cybersecurity, if I went into Bob Stevens, the CEO and president at the time, and I said I want $1 million for my security budget, I would have also been laughed out of the room. Because for $1 billion company like Lockheed, I was spending more like 30 or 40 million. It was a much, much bigger number. So if you don't understand the finances, how are you going to know how much or how little to spend on cybersecurity? And further, where do you spend that money? If you have one business unit that's making $20 million profit, and you have another business unit that has an application, an e-commerce solution that's making $50,000 profit, that's important because you're not going to spend the same amount on both. You might spend $500,000 or $1 million on something that's making a $20 or $30 million profit, but you're not going to spend it on something that's making 50K. So you need to have an understanding of the financial of the business because remember, chief information security officer. You're an executive level position and executives run businesses on finances. So if you don't understand the finances, if you don't know what the key processes and the critical data is, you're not going to make the decisions that you need to make to protect, secure, and lock down the organization. So it's very, very important that you're not only looking at the critical data and the business processes that support that, but you understand the financial data to know where the prioritization and how much to spend on security. So that's your first piece, the critical data. You want to control and manage it. Now, here's the balance. In an ideal case for confidentiality, we would want our data in one spot. To protect and control the confidentiality, all of our data is in one spot, one location, controlled and locked down. So we only have one spot that we have to protect. The problem is with attacks like ransomware, where your data is encrypted or not accessible, having all your data in one single location with no backups is very, very dangerous. So for ransomware and availability, we want it in 4 or 5 locations. The trick is this. We want it in more than one, but less than X, where X is a large number, right? We don't want our critical data in 100 spots, but we want it in more than one. So typically 3 to 5, depending on the business or organization, would be the right number. But that's something that you need to understand, know, and control and manage your data, because data is so portable in a digital format that people could easily move, copy, and change it in locations where you might not be aware of what it is. So as a CISO, your first thing is to be obsessed with the data. What is the critical data? What is the financial data to drive the criticality and how much you're going to spend? Where is it located, and how do you control and manage access to that critical data and critical information? The next area of a CISO is risk. Security is all about managing and mitigating risk to your critical data. Risk is the probability of loss. Risk is the probability of something happening in the future. And risk is really composed of 2 things: threats and vulnerabilities. Now, here's the issue. A threat is the potential for harm. A threat is somebody trying to cause harm to your organization. Ransomware can be a threat. An exploit can be a threat. And then a vulnerability is a weakness that allows that threat to manifest itself. Now, if you look at those 2 factors, which one do you typically control? You typically don't control threats. You can't control foreign adversaries. You can't control ransomware. You can't control exploits. So you really can't control the threats. But you do control the vulnerabilities. An unpatched system is a vulnerability. An outdated operating system is a vulnerability. You control that. So because most people recognize that they can only control the vulnerability, they can't control the threat, they start going in and just fixing random vulnerabilities. I've had organizations say anything from, we fix 30 vulnerabilities a day, or we make sure all vulnerabilities are fixed within a certain time period, which is okay. But here's the issue. We want to go in and let threat drive the risk decision and vulnerability drive risk remediation. Fixing random vulnerabilities is not effective. Now, I have some people push and go, but Eric, isn't fixing some vulnerabilities better than nothing? No, and here's why. If the number of vulnerabilities were fixed and finite, so if it was a set number that never changed, then that would be correct. Because if I fixed 10 vulnerabilities a day, eventually the number would decrease and it would get to 0. Unfortunately, that's not reality. Today, the way it works is vulnerabilities are infinite and dynamic. So if you're fixing 5 vulnerabilities in which there's no threat, you're wasting time, energy, and effort when you could have actually been fixing vulnerabilities that really mattered. So you always want to go in and ask the first question, what are the threats that have the highest likelihood? Until you understand the threats to your business with the highest likelihood, you're wasting time fixing vulnerabilities, because if you don't know the threats, you're fixing random vulnerabilities, and most of the time they're not correct, they're not the highest priority, and they're not effective. So you always want to say, what are the threats that have the highest likelihood? Then you want to ask, what are the vulnerabilities that will allow those threats to cause harm to our critical data with the biggest impact? And then those are the vulnerabilities that we want to fix and address. And what I find is if you look at most of these major breaches, they all have the same major vulnerabilities. So if you want to just sort of a little quick check for CISOs, all of the major breaches that have happened, they had servers accessible from the internet that were unpatched, that contained critical data that weren't properly encrypted. Those are major vulnerabilities, but they never looked at the threat. If they recognized the threat of somebody breaking in from the internet and stealing their data, they would have focused in on internet-facing systems first. But many companies weren't doing a threat-based analysis and they missed it. So if you want the high priority list of most companies, you should be focusing in on servers accessible from the internet that are missing patches, that have critical data that's not encrypted. Those are focusing on the threats that have the highest likelihood and the vulnerabilities that have the biggest impact. But if you're not using both components of the risk formula, you're fixing random issues, which isn't very effective. So threats drive the risk calculation and vulnerabilities drive risk remediation. So now we covered critical data, which is the first area, and we then covered risk, which is the second area. The third area that a CISO has to focus on is CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. We all know what they mean, but let's just review. Confidentiality is prevent, detect, deter the unauthorized disclosure of information. Integrity is prevent, detect, deter the unauthorized alteration of information. And availability is prevent, detect, deter the unauthorized denial of access to information. Now, most people, when they think of cybersecurity, they're really focused in on confidentiality, keeping secret. That seems to be the main focus, protecting data, protecting information leakage, protecting somebody from stealing data. However, what we've seen over the last couple of years, and will continue to see, is ransomware is starting to become a very big vector because they're directly financially driven attacks. If I steal critical data, I can eventually make money. But I have to go on the dark web, I have to find buyers, I have to sell it, I have to do all those things. So yeah, it'll eventually make me some money, but it's a long, hard process to get there. However, with ransomware, I make the money immediately. You pay me to get your data back. So ka-ching, 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 I'm making the money right out of the gate. So we're seeing an increase in ransomware attack, which is really focused on the availability issue. And here's the problem. Most companies say, oh, our data is backed up in multiple locations, but it's a transparent backup. The data just seamlessly moves to those different areas. So now if you get hit with ransomware, the ransomware will also spread very quickly to all those areas and be impactful. So what a CISO needs to do is strategically is recognize the difference between a transparent and a non-transparent backup. A transparent backup is live replication of data, which is great if a server accidentally goes down. But transparent backups isn't effective with ransomware. In those cases, you need to have the non-transparent backups where you're either backing up to tape or have it in a location that if your primary data stores get impacted, you still have the data offline somewhere safe to be able to recover and get that information back up and running. Now, one of the big challenges I find is organizations are misaligned. So, for example, your company might think that integrity is the most important, like if you're a bank, but your security officer thinks confidentiality is important, so you're spending money in the wrong areas. So here's one of my favorite exercises I have CISOs do. And I found this out by a little consulting gig. I have a lot of executives that I do work for, and they'll call me for advice. And several years ago, a CEO of a large utility company called me up and said, Eric, I have a problem. 3 years ago, I recognized the importance of security, and I hired one of the best chief information security officers from Wall Street, and I gave him a $20 million budget. It is now 3 years later, our security is not improved, and all the money's spent. I want to know what went wrong. I want to know what the problem is. So I always do thinking time around consulting gigs, and I'm thinking, okay, what could have caused this? I'll be honest with you, one of the things I thought of is the CISO embezzled the money and is going to move to Belize, right, and live next to John McAfee, right? I'm like, well, okay, but probably not. The other idea I came up with was misalignment. So here's where I came up with this exercise. So I went and sat down with the CEO and the executives, and I gave them a pie chart, a circle. And I said, okay, what percent of this pie is confidentiality? What percent of this pie is integrity? And what percent of this pie is availability? Now, at first, they say all three are important. So great. 33%, 33%, 33%. And then they start moving the lines around. So in this case, they moved the lines around where availability and integrity were definitely more important than confidentiality. Then I looked at where this CISO spent the $20 million. And based on the CISO's background, he always felt and thought that confidentiality was the most important. So I went in and I plotted all the $20 million that he spent into either confidentiality, integrity, availability, and I created another pie chart. Now, here's the problem. If you looked at the pie chart of the executives and the pie chart of where the CISO spent the money, they weren't even similar. They were completely misaligned, and that's one of the big problems. So you want to make sure as a CISO, before you start spending money, you understand at an executive level what's important to the company. What are the critical business processes and data, typically driven by finance? What are the biggest risks to the company? And what is most important from a confidentiality, integrity, and availability standpoint? And then make sure that your security plan is aligned with those three areas. Because nothing's worse than spending a lot of money, spending a lot of energy, and spending a lot of effort in the wrong areas. So as I close, I just want to take you back to the beginning. There's a difference between doing good and doing the right things. Most organizations are doing good when it comes to security because they're just doing random things. The right things are really aligned in three areas. What are the risks? What are the threats and vulnerabilities to your critical data? So you need to be able, as a CISO, you should have a piece of paper that says, what is our critical data? What are the threats that have the highest likelihood of causing harm to that critical data? What are the vulnerabilities in our organization that would allow those threats to have the biggest impact? And then what is most important? Confidentiality, integrity, or availability. If you have one piece of paper that has those three things outlined and you're using that as your approach, you are thinking strategically and you are aligned with companies that are winning. Organizations that are losing are not able to go in and answer those questions. So just to wrap up, the three most critical questions in any organization. What are your biggest risks? Which ones have the highest impact to your organization? And what are the most cost-effective ways of reducing those risks? All of your strategic analysis needs to be based off of critical data, threats, vulnerabilities, and confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So you need to have all that information on one piece of paper so you can think strategically, act strategically, and make a difference in securing and protecting your organization. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Life of a CISO. If I can help you in any way, shape, or form, please visit www.secure-anchor.com and please join us for our next episode.